Became friends with Sid while he was a schoolboy. You know, before I came down here, I was just considering that in the studio. Additionally, I believe that my first encounter with Sid was at Imagine Pink Floyd's Gloomy Poet of the Abyss. Roger Waters, finally revealing the identities of the 6 ladies whose voices created Mental Gorgeous. These shoutouts are not informal. Each of these lifelines and emotional landmines was a tempest of tension and inspiration that molded the man behind the bass. Patti Smith, the punk priestess whose unvarnished sermons of poetry and grit blasted into W's life like a bolt of crimson lightning, was the first woman to light Watt's universe on fire. He remembers her coming to that dark loft in New York, not for a meeting but as a reckoning. Her words burning like coals to tinder, her voice cutting through the smoke of cigarettes. Patti's intelligence was fire-forged. A dagger aimed at his defenses, each poem. The promise that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness was whispered in each verse. Their fortuitous meeting at CBGB's was more purgatorial in nature and less fanboy. As if calling forth the spirits of every disregarded outsider, she stood in the middle of the platform, her shawl swirling and her eyes burning. The weight of her reality caused Waters, who was transfixed, to feel his own barriers collapse. Subsequently, she held out her hand, inviting him to remove his self-made armor and bleed on the exposed page. He was impressed by Patti's ability to transform her admissions into defiance, to bare her soul in a scream, and then tenderly hold it in a lullaby. She described damaged hearts as battle scars rather than flaws, evidence of surviving in a society that is too willing to ignore the cries of women. Waters also recognized himself in Patti's eyes, a wounded visionary yearning for genuineness amid a sea of pretenses. They were connected by electric anguish, a shared communion where he offered her a witness and she voiced his misgivings. The belief that art must burn furiously to illuminate the darkness kindled 2 kindred spirits. Then came Debbie Harry, whose blonde ambition and leather-clad disobedience, blonde ambition encased in a leather jacket, sliced through Roger's routine like flames. He can still clearly recall his first impression of her walking across the stage with Blondie. Her lips curled into a secret smile that suggested both steel and vulnerability, and her gaze was a burning challenge. He felt his own finely crafted armor crack in that electrified moment under the floodlights. They escaped to a dimly lit hallway backstage at a rain-soaked 1979 festival where the air throbbed with the radiance of her performance. There was more to their whispered conversation than mere banter. A collision of spirits occurred. Through cigarette smoke, she spoke of desire and disobedience, each word a gentle invitation that caused his beliefs to fall apart. She responded to him with furious solidarity rather than sympathy after he confessed his repressed concerns. Debbie's subversion was her tenderness. A hard core that dared the world to underestimate her was hidden in her honeyed voice. Observing how she turns a straightforward pop hook into an emotional combatant, Waters understood that opposites were where great power flourished. Melody and menace, grace and grit. The sound of her footsteps echoing in his chest after she left was a continual reminder that beauty and rebellion could coexist in one pulse, and that the most powerful strength was the ability to be both compassionate and wild. Movies, rock and roll, and television used to be discussed in the entertainment industry. No more. This has completely blown them away, and it's so difficult to stay focused while you're doing that. Then the acid-tongued siren, Grace Slick, appeared. The acid-tongued siren's voice exploded like a rebellious supernova into the Waters' mind. He remembers their tragic meeting in a Malibu home in the violet light of sunset, where her wry chuckles rang out from the walls like a challenge hurled at his melancholy feet. He was forced to face the emptiness he had concealed behind his own grandiosity as she spoke in cosmic riddles, her words both dagger and balm. Grace was elemental on stage, a sequin-draped tempest with high notes that spiraled upward as though she were trying to lift the moon out of the sky. Enthralled, Waters felt the thunder of her performance tremble beneath the fragile castle of his sorrow. As volcanic gas burned through the studio smoke haze, their arguments became heated. She forced him to unearth the long-buried cracks in his heart, exposing a weakness he had long denied. It was flammable alchemy, their friendship, his deep introspection and her scathing wit. Every conversation ignited fires that charred the quiet. Waters heard the sound of his own unsaid agony, broken and raw, in Grace's trademark scream, which was equal parts defiance and despair. She was both muse and tormentor. He was permanently altered by her presence, and he would always be pursuing the echo of her siren song in every chord he dared to play. Chrissie Hynde swept into his life after her storm. One stormy London night, Waters saw a fire-cracked mirror in Chrissie, a punk hurricane shrouded in rebellious cool that blew into his universe. Her laughter, each note a declaration of independence, echoes in his mind like shattered glass. The smoke of cigarettes and half-empty whiskey glasses kindled their link, and she challenged him to remove the velvet drapes of perfection he had meticulously created. Her remarks caused his chest to tremble as they discussed authenticity under the neon club lights, as though it were a prohibited substance. Instead of floating on polished echoes, she dared him to let his own voice quake with reality by exposing him to the raw pulse of revolt. In contrast to the complacency that threatened to lull him into artistic calm, Chrissie's presence was a challenge and a call to action. With the resolve of someone who would rather bleed than bend, he saw her stand alone on stage with her guitars hung low and her eyes burning. Their working relationship was explosive, and their studio sessions were tense as her angular riffs collided with his rich grooves. He had a tremble in his soul with each chord she struck, as if her music had uncovered hidden fragments of his own rebellion. There was a spiritual weight to their late-night confessions. She talked about survival and sacrifice, about defying a society that expected males to be tough and women to be soft. Waters stood in the silence, changed, as Chrissie left, leaving the reverberation of her unadulterated strength behind. She showed him that being by himself was a victory of self-possession rather than a sign of loneliness. Her spirit haunted his riffs, a glimmer of unrestrained rebellion that muttered in each note, "Be uncompromising. Don't apologize. Be yours." Then, on a rain-soaked London street in the early 1980s, Waters' soul was captured by the nocturnal charms of the goth enchantress, Su Sisu, who was a gothic enchantress. The instant her eyes met his, he felt a chill of electricity, a quiet assurance of beauty entwined with peril. Her voice coiled around each note like smoke around a candle flame as she glided like a phantom queen. Shrouded in darkness on stage, Waters, who had always designed sound barriers, discovered that they were collapsing beneath her ghostly wail. It was alchemy in action when they briefly collaborated on a charity single. Her vocals sliced through the quiet like a velvet knife, while his bass lines throbbed in the darkness like a heartbeat. With her shivering whispers floating above his rumble, and his rumbling low end anchoring her ethereal tremors, they were like two kindred spirits linked in the flickering half-light of the studio. Unspoken confessions, longing defiance, and a mutual hunger for truths that daylight couldn't sing blazed through their relationship. Working with SEO seemed like dancing on the brink of oblivion, as Waters would later admit. Her presence was a warning as well as an invitation, as though she had dug into the deepest recesses of his heart and held them to the light. Each take left him bare and vulnerable under her scrutiny. He stood in startled quiet as the last track faded, her echo pulsing through his veins. There was more to that partnership than just music. It was a transformational ritual that haunts him to this day in every shadow he creates with his foundation. At last, his heart was won over by Florence Welch. Years later, at a charity event in London, under the glittering chandelier, through stained glass windows, Waters first heard Florence's voice unfold like molten gold. A conflagration of triumphant defiance and ancient pain. Time broke in that instant. In her deafening crescendos, he saw the ghost of his earlier self, the bold dreamer who dared to toss lyrics into the void. Her eyes blazed with a fire that both challenged and begged him to recall as she walked toward the grand piano. As they sat side by side, the clamor of the outside world subsided into quiet awe. Waters felt his heart change, uncovering memories he had buried beneath layers of cynicism. as Florence used a single chord to call forth all the rebellions of youth and the pain of every scar. Each note was a naked confession that echoed his own inner cries as he saw her fingers move with pure abandon over the keys. His eyes glistened with tears of admiration at her daring communion with the impossible, not nostalgia. The piano appeared to give way under the weight of their mutual devotion as their duet reached its peak, their hearts interwoven in a timeless tapestry of music. He discovered a prodigy and a mirror in Florence, her joyful recklessness shattering his stoicism, and her cathedral cries rekindling a reckless hope he thought had long since died. Waters rose and trembled with an emotion he had assumed was only for younger times as the last note faded into nothingness. "Thank you." He was thankful that this contemporary siren, with her Gothic elegance and fervent roar, served as a reminder that the real revolt lay not in barriers or walls, but in the courage to feel everything and to bleed notes into the air without fear. Roger Waters learned in Florence's wake that her voice would always reverberate in his throat. A real-life example of the strength of accepting vulnerability at the brink of disaster. Why now? And why these 6? Perhaps Waters suddenly realizes that his biggest revelations came from the furious harmonies of these women rather than from the echoes of his own voice after decades of building walls around his grief and creating soundscapes of isolation. They each swung a chisel into the rock of his doubt. Patty's unreserved honesty broke through his barriers. His austere exterior was broken by Debbie's sly tenderness. Hidden sorrow was chiseled out by Grace's razor-sharp sarcasm. Chage. He learned to stand alone and erect thanks to Rissy's unwavering posture. The darkness that Cozy had long suppressed were exposed by his chiaroscuro of beauty and danger. And the rebellious spark he thought had been extinguished was rekindled by Florence's cathedral shouts. Collectively, they were dynamic forces of nature rather than merely muses. Confessions that invited vulnerability, consolations that provided healing, and confrontations that compelled confession. Waters found his own cracks, the sharp edges of heartache, and the rays of hope beyond the emptiness in their voices. More profound than any riff or song he had ever written, he discovered a freedom. Roger Waters now stands on a threshold, not behind a wall, paying tribute to the sirens who broke his seclusion and singing the songs that were sparked by those breaches. These 6 rock ladies constructed the cathedrals in his soul, even though he may be the architect of sound.